I would actually like to hand it over to Carl and thank him again for participating. And just to note that Casey Rich is our sort of technical director for this meeting. So thank you, Carl.
Oh, yeah, thanks so much for having me. And thanks for everyone coming out. I know it's the end of the day for you. So, well, I'm going to talk about the project that Michael was mentioning, urban cultural policy, changing dynamics of cultural production. It's something we're wrapping up now and we're writing up our final publications on. And I'll talk about some of the framing work we did early on and segue into talking through a couple of the more recent publications we've been doing. So this project, I'm working alongside my colleagues here in Australia from creative industries and geography, and I'm coming at this from an urban planning background. So I mean, it's been really an interesting kind of interdisciplinary mix that we're bringing to looking at this topic, and we all kind of wanted to come together because we were really interested in studying what we saw as an under-recognized or underappreciated relationship between arts and creative or cultural industries on the one hand, and manufacturing, particularly an emerging small urban manufacturing sector. And we've variously conducted work in Australia, US, Europe, and China. Most of the work has been focused on Sydney, Melbourne, and San Francisco. We've also done some work in New York and Berlin, Milan, and Shenzhen in China. And I guess the kind of genesis for this project it's worth mentioning first off is, before I moved to Australia, I was actually funded by the National Endowment for the Arts to do a very small kind of version of this back in like 2013, 14, that on a grant I had to give up because I moved to Australia. I was no longer working at a US university. But the kernel of looking at this dynamic has really stuck with me. And we finally got, back in 2017, we got funding from the Australian Research Council to continue this much larger project. But the genesis at that time, back in the early 2010s, was really work coming out of the Brookings Institution, and a number of my academic colleagues in geography and planning were looking at a kind of post-GFC revival of particularly small urban manufacturing in US cities. But the more and more this was talked about, they kept missing the fact that a lot of what defines this manufacturing persistence, and in some cases growth, is this tie to the cultural sectors. And a lot of it's really about material cultural production. So on the one hand, you have firms that are making actual cultural products, working in apparel, furnishing, home and lifestyle products, and food is a really big one, of course. And then on the other hand, you have this set of industries, as well as others that are working with, say, wood or metal to supply the architecture industry for specialized cabinetry or lighting, working on set design and so forth. So you have these kind of services and supply chains going on as well that are not always outsourced and globalized, but a big portion of it is actually localized for those industries that need that immediate and specialized service. And I guess what's interesting too is that this type of work doesn't function as your kind of traditional notion of big manufacturing that operates on the city fringe. But a lot of times it really functions more like the cultural sectors. These manufacturing firms tend to cluster in urban areas, and they tend to gravitate to high-cost cities, which creates a whole host of problems that we've been talking about for a long time in terms of artistic activity, but it's actually, very, very real here as well. And so the sort of purpose of the larger project was to understand how the kind of changing industry dynamics that are encouraging this sort of manufacturing activity to exist, as well as the urban development dynamics around redevelopment and urban upscaling, gentrification, and so forth, how that's affecting this relationship, where we might see opportunities for policy intervention and the kind of challenges that we have to deal with around business development, workforce, and land use issues. And the latter is where I've, amongst the team, where I've focused most of my time. And cultural production, I think, is like, the foundation of where we're coming from is like this sort of thing that's a really material cultural production that's overlooked in urban cultural policy at large. I think we tend to look at, from a planning perspective, at least when we're looking at arts and cultural sector, it tends to look towards the flagship cultural projects, and it's really rooted around generating consumption and boosting the city image in a variety of different ways. Or it's kind of lumping the cultural industries in with this larger set of highly skilled, knowledge-based industries, tech-driven development, and so forth. And that's certainly the way things have been occurring in Australia for the last 20 years. And I think our argument here is that essentially, so, there's some shortcomings here, but it also creates a bias in the kind of industries and the places, the geographies where we're investing, where we're looking, and we're really missing this big important opportunity. And so, on the cultural policy side, we're kind of missing this. But I think on the other hand, on the manufacturing side, industrial policy, we're missing a huge opportunity, as well as, a lot of cities and really kind of misunderstand or don't pursue policy that supports the reality of manufacturing in places like US and Australia today. And Chris Gibson and I did a paper on this, surveying the actual policy that's out there. In industrial policy and land use, it's really still geared towards this high volume, low cost manufacturing that what remains within these countries is on the suburban fringe, or it is increasingly being refocused around innovation districts, and the knowledge economy is kind of very manufacturing that's driven by a high level of R&D, and it can connect to these innovation districts that cities are chasing now. And I think what this is missing is the reality, again, that a lot of manufacturing is really small and specialized. It's tied to cultural production. It is what we say low tech and high touch, meaning it doesn't move through these big breakthroughs through research and development, but it's more incremental, and it's really hands-on work. It's people that work in those type of things I mentioned around everything from woodwork for set design to metalworking and bread and these kind of things that we see grow recently in cities the last 10 years. I guess the other kind of statistic to mention for this too in Australia, and I'm pretty sure it's the same in the US, 90% or just shy of 90% of all manufacturing in the country, the firms employ fewer than 20 people, and about 3/4 of them actually employ less than 5. So, just this kind of statistic speaks for themselves in terms of the character of manufacturing, that most of the activity doesn't really need that land on the outer fringe where cities like Melbourne have been planning for it. And a lot of this has to do, again, with the kind of nature of this manufacturing. Within cultural product manufacturing and beyond, this kind of larger set of low-tech, high-touch industries that I'm mentioning about, you have this high level of interaction between firms. They're small, so they need to have that interaction and that product and process networking, and they rely on generally a middle and higher skilled workforce, and the kind of products that they make are more focused on high value added design intensive of products. So they have different location features than your traditional manufacturing. And one of the first things we set out to do was a case study in Sydney in an area called Merrickville. It's an inner city, central city industrial district. And that, it at the time was, and still sort of is, under threat from redevelopment for something that Sydney's been doing quite a bit because of its very hot housing market, is sort of 20 to 40-story apartment towers with transit-oriented development, looking at this area as underutilized and outdated, and something that's really ripe for redevelopment and to capitalize on that devalued property that comes with industrial land. And we went through there and documented all the activity there, and were able to show that no, this is actually a very vibrant, important area right in the middle of the city. And in fact, it's what we call a cluster of last resort, meaning as other industrial districts in Sydney are rezoned to mixed use or residential, these manufacturing creative enterprises are then funneling into Merrickville. And so that, I mean, that's a big part of what we're trying to argue here. And then the other thing is just simply the clustering dynamics and the network dynamics in terms of all the different enterprises you have that work at this interface across the cultural industry, the more service design oriented traditional kind of understanding that we have of it alongside cultural manufacturing, that are all seeking out a similar kind of place for the same reasons, essentially because it has accessible, affordable space. And I guess I should mention too, in the bottom here, this image is like the kind of core of the activity. It's a former auto plant that has been divided up into over 100 different pods for small artists and creative entrepreneurs and manufacturers. And so kind of summing this up, what we're looking at is this kind of set of push and pull factors for cultural manufacturing that I think are pretty familiar to everyone. You have this attraction because of the skilled workforce and clients, the built environment of the center city, but then you also have these push factors around rising rents, the loss of industrial zone, which has kind of created an affordable shelter for a lot of firms. But then also you have some agglomeration of manufacturing activity out in the outer area. So these kind of changing dynamics that influence location patterns for cultural manufacturing. And I know we're at a cultural policy seminar, but I do want to talk a little bit more about industrial land simply because I think it plays into what I'm going to be arguing, in the second half of this. Essentially, this really interesting dynamic. So Melbourne's a great example. Over the last 20 years, year to year, they've actually had a net increase of industrial land, despite the deindustrialization, despite the job loss in manufacturing. So what I'm showing you here is a picture of the Hoddle grid, which is Melbourne's CBD, and the total amount added annually of industrial land on the fringe. So we're actually getting about 1.5 CBDs every year in industrial land that's being added to the fringe in terms of this growth. But overall, even though we see this growth, we're actually, over that 20-year period, we've lost a really significant portion of industrial land at the same time, particularly in those inner zones, those smaller inner and middle suburban industrial districts, because again, they're kind of seen as really outdated because we don't have manufacturing activity, or that we have needs that outer transport connections and the lower cost land and so forth. And it's not really thinking through the reality of this small specialized manufacturing that exists in places like Melbourne. And it's up against this very familiar kind of industrial gentrification narrative of cities wanting to bank on that devalued property for dealing with their housing challenges. Melbourne, Sydney, are very much like San Francisco or New York or Los Angeles that have a really major housing crisis. But at the same time, this is really producing, windfall profits for very few people and doing these developments. And you're losing this really rich, important employment zone. So as we're struggling to keep up on housing, we're actually losing the good jobs that we have in a lot of cases. And this is contributing to the polarized economy that we have in Melbourne. So what this kind of, I think, gets at for me is that we're working in these, continue to work in these policy silos across urban cultural policy on the one hand, industrial policy on the other. Neither of them are perfect, but by bringing them together, we really create kind of new targets and new opportunities, new places to look at, new industries, and really start to address previously ignored kind of cross-sectoral opportunities around skill building and business development and land use. But I guess, you know, at the same time, we have our Sydney case, and there's a few other case studies out there, but we don't really have a good documentation of the extent to which industrial zones really matter for cultural production, material culture production, the extent to which there's actually co-location activity between creative industries and cultural manufacturing. There really isn't any work documenting this, so we wanted to try to do this on a larger regional scale, to see what we could find to kind of help support what we're talking about. And so we did 2 papers on this that are complementary that I'll be drawing from on the second half of the talk here is looking at these location patterns and the role of industrial land in helping to support or explain some of this agglomerative activity. And what we did then, so we looked at the Australia, New Zealand standard industrial classification codes. And this is like NAICS in the US and Canada. It's quite similar. And we took the codes and data and divided up into 3 different categories. So you have your kind of cultural industries that are more service and design oriented through media, publishing, and architecture and so forth. Cultural manufacturing. And again, this is what I've been talking about, mostly about the production of these cultural products or products with high symbolic value, and ancillary manufacturing, which are making indirect contributions towards cultural products. So wood, paper, textile finishing, and so forth. And then in one of the other papers, we also looked separately at food and beverage and compared that and cultural manufacturing to manufacturing as a whole. But I'm going to just, for the sake of time and focus, I'll focus on this kind of 3-part division here. And we did the study in Melbourne. Obviously, I'm based here, but it's actually like really the perfect kind of place to look at these questions. Melbourne is Australia's sort of historic core for manufacturing, and it has a legacy of established manufacturers that have been here for a very long time. It also has a fairly large stock of older industrial buildings. And at the same time today, it's sort of Australia's cultural capital. It's a very high per capita presence of artists and really strong creative industry support here. So it's a great place that brings together these 2 kind of dynamics that I'm talking about. And we looked at total employment and employment change over time. We ran LQs or location quotients for the 3 sectors here. Location quotient or LQ is essentially a basic measure of concentration comparing a location to, in our case, the national average. And then finally, we conducted a hotspot analysis in GIS using GEDIS or GI star, which gives us a statistically significant picture of employment concentration in Melbourne. And we did this for each of the 3 types. As well as 2 subsectors, one fashion and another architecture design, and trying to like kind of pull out the inferences around co-location that we could find, and sort of setting up this proxy of co-location as the potential for shared space requirements and inter-industry linkages and so forth. So I'll start out by talking about just the kind of descriptive numbers in the LQs, comparing inner Melbourne with greater Melbourne. And just to give you a sense here, I put this little map up in this busy slide here. This little piece right here is inner Melbourne compared to the larger region. You know, I think most of what we see is pretty familiar, but some of it's, I think, still interesting. I mean, looking at greater Melbourne as a whole, not surprisingly, over the 5-year period, the most recent 5-year period that we have ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics data, seeing a decline in manufacturing and a growth of the cultural industries. That said, cultural manufacturing is declining at a slower rate than this this broader, heavier industry category of ancillary manufacturing, and that goes for manufacturing as a whole as well. What's interesting though is looking at the location quotients. Employment is smaller in the manufacturing sectors than cultural, of course, but for Melbourne, you get a really strong concentration, particularly in cultural manufacturing. So 1.55 is like 55% above the national average. It's quite strong. Turning to inner Melbourne, similar dynamic, but more pronounced. You see this bigger growth of cultural industries, bigger loss of manufacturing employment. And again, I would just point out that this also coincides with this major loss of industrial land. It's you know, as I'll hopefully be able to show, we've been trying to show it's not simply a process of deindustrialization and outsourcing. Looking at the LQs, really strong cultural sector, and you know, to be honest, like I think it's 60% of all cultural industry employment is just right in that little core of Melbourne. And again, those really low LQs for manufacturing, below the national average, but cultural manufacturing is again stronger than ancillary or manufacturing as a whole. So I'm turning to the hotspot maps now, and this gives you a picture of the kind of zoomed out most of Greater Melbourne region for the cultural industries, and you can really see how strongly concentrated this activity is. I mean, we expected it to be concentrated, but I expected, like, you know, like in a US city, you might pick up a few nodes on the middle suburbs or in outer employment areas, but just because of the very nature of Melbourne and this, you know, really kind of core periphery model, you get this centralization of this sort of activity. And then zooming in on the inner area, you can see how the hotspots are all clustered around the CBD and going south. South Melbourne is a former industrial area that was redeveloped ages ago with major art district, with flagship museums and so forth, as well as quite a bit of office space. Port Melbourne Fisherman's Bend is an industrial area with huge range of stuff. It's where they make Vegemite even. You know, you still get a little bit of a cluster there, which is interesting. This area, however, has been slated for redevelopment. It's a big controversial redevelopment project over the last just 8 years now, I think. So you know, you see this clustering here, and then when we look at ancillary manufacturing, that larger scale, heavier industry, not surprisingly, there's only 3 clusters. They're surrounded by the industrial districts, the few that remain here. But then cultural manufacturing is a little bit more interesting because you get more of these hotspots appearing, but again, they're predominantly aligned with industrial districts. I think it also starts to kind of help us think about these different location patterns for the different types of industries, as well as the role of industrial land here, because you know, the few places where they're not showing up in industrial areas are these older industrial suburbs like Cremorne that exist in Melbourne. And this is another image to give you a sense of those hotspot differences between cultural industries and the ancillary manufacturing. And these 3 kind of yellow funny shapes are our state-sponsored industrial precincts. These are where the state's been investing heavily in industrial real estate and expanding and try to consolidate manufacturing. And you get pretty good alignment of the manufacturing there. The airport's out here, so not surprisingly, we get a big cluster there as well. And again, just to kind of highlight that centrality of cultural industries. And this differs from cultural manufacturing that's kind of walking this line between the two. So particularly in the Southeast, you have a pretty big concentration in the industrial precinct there, but then again, you have this kind of spread in the core as well in terms of the hotspots there. So they're kind of cutting across this geography and reflecting, I think, that set of push and pull factors I was discussing earlier. And I guess I'll be mentioning this a few times, but like it starts to make us think about, you know, that kind of geography of cultural policy and where we kind of tend to focus more central. We assume that's where most of the activity takes place. So 2 more slides on this, on our subsectors. This is fashion industry cutting across the 3 kind of types of culture industries, manufacturing. And so design services, where fashion design falls under, you get a really high percentage, nearly 50% are in inner Melbourne, NLQ, a location quotient of almost 2. But then interestingly, you also get fairly significant percentages of activity in clothing manufacturing and jewelry. And you know, particularly for jewelry, you don't need a lot of space. You can have a very small space and work central. And so I think that helps to explain why we get a stronger concentration of activity there. And then further out, you see the, you know, textile finishing and cut and sew textile, which, you know, of course, in I think fashion and apparel, most of that is outsourced and materials are brought in to be made here, you know, the final kind of production. But some of that still does exist. And we did see that in the Sydney and Merrickville example as well, that local fashion designers are relying on small contract cut and sew operators. So you in this case, you have this pretty tight concentration in the center, but there's still that regional or greater metro links that are occurring. And architecture and design kind of focuses similarly. This is a cluster out in Southeast Melbourne, around Dandenong in the Southern State Industrial Precinct. You have just 5% of architects employed out there. Not a surprise, I don't think. You know, but overall strong concentration for the metro area. But what you do get there is a really, really strong concentrations of things like glass and ceramics, and even furniture production. And that sits alongside these indirect contributions, particularly in architectural products as well. So this is, again, a slightly different kind of setup, but you know, I just know my wife's an architect and we talk about this all the time, the importance of relying on these various manufacturers, whether it's you know, window producers or someone you can go to and get a specialized doorknob or whatever, that they really need this kind of activity locally, that you can't just have an architect's office and everything gets brought in from outside for the construction industry. So just wrapping up with thoughts on the mapping activity and the larger picture that I've given you. I guess a couple of takeaways from the mapping work in Melbourne, really that, I mean, I think cultural manufacturing persists here, despite the policy working against it, despite the overall employment decline. We still see inner city concentrations of this type of manufacturing for I think various reasons, and I think it's likely because of the functional similarities between the different sectors, between the you know, more design service oriented creative industries, cultural industries, and cultural manufacturing. But at the same time, I think cultural manufacturing is much more cost sensitive. It depends on these industrial zones. And so the loss of this space is really has a pretty big impact on how these manufacturers can exist. So one of the things we're doing, so Declan Martin, my PhD student on this project, who helped me with a lot of the mapping work, his PhD is also looking at one of these central industrial districts in an area called Brunswick in central Melbourne, looking at survival strategies of the existing manufacturers there. So, you know, how are they able to stay put with all of this going on in terms of rezoning and cost rise in this very high, very expensive real estate market, and finding some interesting dynamics around balancing this, you know, typical kind of specialization in what they do with being forced to be more versatile to adapt to that environment, and all the kind of things around resource and space sharing that, you know, we might see in the arts sector as well. And what else? So, I mean, I think, for me, and like where a lot of my work has really gravitated towards is around this importance of industrial zones for that interaction across the sector, and the need for this, and to begin to think about, from an economic geography perspective, zoning as a factor for explaining agglomeration alongside traditional features like labor pools and information and knowledge sharing and so forth, because you can really see how it plays a role for this type of activity. And then finally, we're putting this out there for new thinking around urban cultural policy to look at the new opportunities that we can develop when we focus on material cultural production as putting it at the center. This opens up these new spaces of policy intervention, new industries to focus on that have different needs and issues that we need to consider. And I think also manufacturing, and one of the big reasons that a lot of people have been focusing more and more on manufacturing is because compared to tourism and consumption jobs, or the really kind of out of reach, very highly skilled, highly educated, knowledge economy jobs, manufacturing offers pretty high quality employment and wages, and really important business development opportunities that kind of go on, that are sort of hidden and important for the way an economy functions, but are kind of ignored because they're not very visible and flashy. And I think this isn't just a role for planning and economic development, but because of the nature of these businesses, it's also something that's important for urban cultural policy as well. And to ask the question if we can sort of all work together, and to consider employment and land use within an urban cultural policy remit, not just as the focus of planning and economic development. And we can think about this because I think urban cultural policy has a history of focusing on artistic work and live spaces, about shared affordable spaces. And we've seen this now bleed into, in places especially like San Francisco, we see it bleed into their industrial policy. And there are so many opportunities. I don't know if it's similar in the US, but in Australia, even before COVID, we had very high retail vacancy rates because overbuilding in these sort of faux mixed use areas with ground floor retail and residential on top that remain vacant. And there's a role for space retrofit, just like we've done with artistic spaces for small scale manufacturing as well. And to start to rethink, finally, I think how we zone and plan around the business mix within different types of industrial zones. This is a really non-traditional role for urban cultural policymakers, but something that I think they could bring a lot to the table because planners don't always understand the sort of nature of this type of activity. So I'll just close with the overly text-heavy slide, a couple of websites where you can pull our research. And these first two are the mapping articles that I was drawing on today, as well as some of the other work we're done. But the full list of all the work would be available on my webpage, and most of it on the urban culture policy page. So thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks, Carl. I logged on a little late, so it's great to see you. And so we'll open it up for discussion now. If anybody has questions, there are a couple of comments in the chat, but I might just start if that's okay. Forgive me if I missed this, if you already talked about this, but I'm wondering if you looked at or have in any of your work kind of the employment and unemployment dynamics of cultural manufacturing as opposed to those more traditional cultural and creative industry occupations, whether or not there's sort of more or less unemployment, more or less sort of shifting in and out of employment and unemployment. I'm trying to get a picture here, especially given the COVID-19 crisis and the impact that's had on obviously CCI, but whether or not you have anything to say and whether or not your measurement has sort of looked at that a bit.
Yeah,
yes,
I mean,
Carl.
yeah. So I mean, I don't know when you jumped in, if you saw this or not. We haven't looked at,
a little bit, and just
we haven't looked at unemployment, but we've variously looked at. So this is by place of work. I didn't mention this, but it's breaking up the geography of Melbourne is where we focused on inner, middle, and outer Melbourne and greater Melbourne as a whole to look at employment change over these two time periods that we have with ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and then we have the new census coming out next year. So hopefully that'll allow us to update this kind of a post-COVID. And I guess for COVID, Melbourne, you probably know, we've been through a pretty horrendous lockdowns. We just finished our third one, which was a cute little 5-day lockdown, and where we can't go, more than 3 miles from the house. So they're pretty severe, and that's had a dramatic effect on creative industries, people that depend on other people coming to see what they do, but also people that can't go into their shop whatsoever. People are, a lot of the things are being sold online now, so that dynamic changes, so that local sales and local retail has been harmed pretty dramatically. So, I mean, I think even though our cases are lower, we're probably dealing with a lot of the same things that are happening in the US on that front. And so, yeah, I mean, so that this is essentially like, looking at that 2011 to 2016 employment and change is what we did in terms of just the basic descriptive statistics.
Right, and that would cover sort of post-recessionary period. So yeah, I would be so interested to see how that obviously covers either prior to that period or even after right now. Yeah.
It just limited by the data because the
Right.
ABS switched over their geography. So it's not directly comparable to, smaller scale, which is why we didn't go back further essentially. So it was an improvement for the long run, but for doing that earlier analysis, it just makes it really difficult.
Yeah, totally understand that. So the couple of chats that I'll just point everybody to. So David Pankratz has a chat that's asking if you could address the contextual and comparative issues. And so he points to Pittsburgh as the work there being driven by the availability of abandoned industrial spaces and social entrepreneurs more than by public policy.
Well, I mean, I'd like get in touch with me and let me know about Pittsburgh because I don't know about it. But I can give you a kind of, I mean, one of the areas I've been focusing on in terms of that, the context is taking a bit of a different tack than what you're saying, but looking at places that are similar, but have different policy contexts. So take Melbourne and San Francisco, for example. Melbourne, I mean, both cities are very high cost real estate markets. They both have this kind of industrial legacy and creative industries base. Melbourne has really kind of shied away from any kind of industrial planning at all. They're just sort of, they're coming to it now more and more. There's a few people within state government, and that's, I guess, another thing, the way the planning systems work are totally different, but there's people in state government that get it and that want to support this, but it's, a lot of powerful property interests going against it. San Francisco, same dynamic of industrial gentrification, yet for a variety of reasons, you have a really strong intermediary organization there called SF Made. A lot of you probably heard of them. Who's very active in supporting and advocating for small manufacturers there. And among the things that they've gone and done is actually work with the city on changing zoning codes to allow hybrid manufacturing office space in the city that allowed them to add the first manufacturing space that they've seen in over 20 years. So like, I think, where I focused and where this research is focused is on those kind of high cost cities. It hasn't been so much like looking at a shrinking city versus a San Francisco or something like that. So I don't have a lot to say there. But I think it's, obviously there would be different dynamics at play, especially around industrial land.
But I also think from a policy point of view, it'll be interesting because here, very much private driven, social entrepreneurs, foundation driven, more than anything that might be called manufacturing policy as more. The policy to take particular notice of that that dynamic, I would say.
Unfortunately, you broke up for a lot of what you're saying. I caught the first part on social entrepreneurs. I would just again point to, a group like SFA that I think is a good example of an intermediary organization that works across both spheres. I think that's something that is, it's not perfect by any means, but it's played an important role in the dynamic in that city. That it's something we don't have here in Australia. I think we have a pretty weak community sector. So the kind of activity that you're talking about would be less common because it's a very strong state, and it is for better, I think, overall, but worse because you lose that community side. You get much more state investment, and so you don't have that other sector emerging to fill the gap.
And just a reminder, anyone can feel free to use the raise hand function or just unmute yourself and ask questions. So Amanda Ashley has a question in the chat too. In those clusters, do you have a sense of whether the cultural industries or owners of these businesses own their buildings or rent for share that or share them with other owners?
Yeah, that's good. So from the Sydney work we did a few years ago and the more recent work in Melbourne here that Declan's doing, virtually everyone's a renter, and they are sharing space. So that example, if you caught it on Sydney of the auto plant, I mean, that's been subdivided. Like you just walk through this warren of hallways and small buildings, and the same thing in the smaller, older industrial spaces that remain in Brunswick and Melbourne. A lot of places, they'll pool their resources to rent out a space. So small manufacturing firms that employ just a few people will come together. And I guess it's also not about the shared space, but the resources too, about people working in between firms as well that go around because of things are kind of always on the move. But just long story short, yeah, it's there's not a lot of ownership here because obviously that would create more stability, but that's not the case. And I guess my comment about versatility, what we found in Melbourne is a lot of these smaller inner city manufacturers are becoming jack of all trades sort of work, rather than just focusing on one or two products that they might want to do, or just the kind of work that they want to do. And that work's going to be coming out soon. So we're just kind of processing the interviews and writing that up now.
Anyone else feel free to unmute themselves with questions or comments?
Okay, can I come in then, Joanna? I've got a question about your categories, Carl. The key categories of analysis are the cultural industries, cultural manufacturing, ancillary manufacturing. I want to know where those come from. Are those the categories that you've sort of brought to your analysis and populated with the data that fills them? Or are they categories that emerge from looking at things like the occupational composition of different kinds of firms, their supply chains, and so on? Where do those categories come from?
Yeah, that's a good question. I suppose it's a little bit of both, because we were drawing on previous research that had looked at industry and occupational analyses for the cultural industries, and our own work and observation on cultural product manufacturing. So, there's no ABS category for cultural industries, same with the US. So we, part of it's subjective. We have to go through and make educated choices about what to include and what to exclude. And I know, 5-10 years ago, there was like endless debate about what should count as a cultural industry for those industry and occupational analyses. And we certainly went through that process and looked at the existing work and adapted it to what we're doing here.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sure.
We have a chat from Karen Bubb. Other than zoning changes, are there other actions government takes in fostering these small cultural manufacturing businesses?
Yeah, So, I mean, I think again, like San Francisco and SF Made is a good example that we've studied of somewhere that, you know, they have the money behind them too. And I think it's part of why they do it, but you know, they get involved in skill development, targeted workforce training for, you know, how to use hand tools, how to do woodworking or ceramics, and these kind of things, depending on skills gaps. They do industrial property searches, so they help firms actually go out and find industrial property. And they run a retail outlet so that they're helping local manufacturers sell their products. So, I mean, those are all examples of things that I've seen that I know take just to varying levels take place in other cities, and that I wish we had here, because I think we're kind of behind what's been going on in the US and that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, and I think overall there's just a lot that can be learned from existing cultural policy that takes place at the city level and cultural affairs departments as well, that can be transferred over. I mean, even when we're talking about affordable space and developing shared workspace. So yeah, I mean, I think again, that's another area where I think we can look to see parallels between the two sectors.
And then Clara Roth.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering whether there are any initiatives that help kind of bring back awareness a little bit more to those industries that, you know, in the sense of the globalization and a lot of things are being imported at cheaper prices, whether bringing visibility back to them by integrating them more into the general city landscape, whether there are any initiatives from the cities or from the people themselves to kind of raise the understanding also why certain things are more expensive because they're being produced on small scale, or because there is, you know, a very long process of knowledge acquisition behind being specialists in the field, and whether, you know, bringing those people back, like whatever crafts and handymen we're talking about, bringing them back into the consciousness of the general public to also help with that image as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think I mean, you know, like with, I think the last 10 years, the maker movement has played a role in that, in terms of emphasizing locally made goods and the value of that. And of course, I think a lot of cities, particularly like little retail districts in center cities, promote, you know, local shopping and local made and these kind of things as well. And, you know, I keep talking about San Francisco, but I just finished writing this article on the evolution of their industrial policy. So, I mean, it's really interesting to see how the way it started was this. I mean, back in the 80s, they tried to do this kind of controlled gentrification where they would allow some activity in, particularly with artists, but that quickly got out of control into the kind of San Francisco that we know. And over time, they started making different arguments around industrial land as important for distribution and repair, things that can't be outsourced. And then that evolved into local production and local making, and where they focus it now. And so the city even, you know, really sells its industrial land as supporting local makers and manufacturers along the lines of what you're talking about, of these things that can't be outsourced, that they are products that like are made from, but also define the city's identity. And so I think they've taken it quite far in terms of what you're talking about there. So, but it was a long process of like 20, 30 years. And I think to embed that in a place, you can't just do like a local made maker fair or something like that, you know, that's like a trendier thing that will, you know, kind of pop up. And I guess at least here it seems to be dying off in terms of its attention, but something like that is really ingrained in the kind of deeper image of the city beyond like a kind of flashy tourist center is something that I think will have a longer lasting impact of that value that you're getting at.
So, Carl, a question that came to me kind of privately, but where to next? So basically, what do you think are the big issues going to be for 10 years out? And what are the big research questions that you want to get at next?
Yeah, so I mean, I like as I've been doing this work, like I mean, if you know my work, it's very been rooted in cultural creative industries and community economic development there. As the more and more I've done this, the more I've latched on to the importance of industrial zoning and that role in, I think, economic development, business development overall for this type of activity and manufacturing more broadly. And we have a new Australian Research Council grant that is going to be looking at industrial lands past and present in Melbourne. So we are looking at old business records, I guess would be equivalent of Sanborn maps in the US that have business counts and maps and tying that to different planning policies over time and to looking at that relationship and how industrial zones change over time to try to help understand what's going on now. And that's the other part of the study of looking at a selection of different industrial zones throughout inner, middle, and outer suburbs in Melbourne. Look at the business mix and to look at how that has evolved more recently and to look for areas of policy intervention. So I guess flipping the lens from a more industry directed study to one that is coming from the land use dimension. And obviously there's much more to it than land use, but that's just personally where I'm excited to focus in the future, because I guess the other thing we see here a lot is, and I didn't mention, but the thing about most cities, the way they zone industrial land, it's really the place where industrial activity can go. It's not going to keep out residents or hotels or gyms or whatever. And so, some things just don't want to go there, but things like gyms, things like breweries that might not have been able to be as of right use in certain industrial zones. We've seen recent code changes that allow this, and you see this giant local brew industry emerge in Melbourne, for example. That's like one of the ways that cultural manufacturing has really grown. So looking at how these more recent zoning changes and push factors on the need for this land are changing the business mix there, and then to look at how we can help and support positive change and to balance that cost dynamic, because certain small firms that might need 2,000 square feet of space, it's not a huge amount of space, but they also can't afford a lot, are going to potentially be competing with those click and collect and logistics kind of hubs that are also emerging in industrial land as well. So it's kind of like a balance of need and use in the contemporary, and then looking at how that's evolved over time as well.
I don't want to, does anyone else have something, a comment or question? So one question I had is, you do look at, you sort of look at land or space as the stimulant for the cultural industries in a certain geography. That's at least how I'm seeing this. So I'm wondering if you know anything about who are the people within the cultural manufacturing jobs, because there's so much obviously literature on connecting people to place and obviously in the creative industries, right? So like, who are the people in these jobs as opposed to the people that we typically think that are in the CCI?
Yeah, I should have, so this is another part of the project, and I have all the data, and I wish I pulled it so I could just answer your question really precisely. But I can't, because I forgot to do that. But we looked at one of the great things about the ABS here you can't do in the US is you can get demographics on all occupations down to like a 4-digit code, which is, I think it's like the six-digit SOC code or whatever it is in the US. I can't even remember anymore, but pretty detailed occupations, we can look at their demographics. But by and large, I can say that in the cities we've studied, people who are employed in manufacturing tend to be, they have more middle wage employment. It's less bifurcated than the economy as a whole between very high and very low wage. And it also tends to take up people that were born overseas at a higher rate than the economy as a whole. So in Australia, they don't break things down by race and ethnicity, but it's broken down by your language and your country of birth. But we do know from the US data as well that, immigrant populations have much higher employment rates in manufacturing than the economy as a whole. So, and then anecdotally, I would say young people as well. A lot of the Brunswick stuff that Declan was studying is young furniture makers and jewelers and things like that.
It's remarkable. That's actually the fascinating part for me, definitely, given that we're hearing so much about the inequities in the CCI, et cetera. And so seeing a different perspective of who's actually working in these jobs. I wanted to read out one more comment before we end, but Janet Merkel, here in Berlin, the city government has begun to reintroduce planning for small manufacturing in inner city areas called, and I'm sorry, I can't pronounce that. So shared buildings specifically for light manufacturing and small companies might be of interest.
Yeah, hi Janet. I still can't see you, but it's been a long time. Yeah, no, that we've been studying some of that kind of stuff in US cities as well. And I definitely I'll copy and paste that and see what I can find, but please send me information. Justin O'Connor, who's also on the project, was doing work in Berlin. So if he hasn't already been focusing on that, I think he in particular would be really interested to hear more about that. That's really great.
I have to mention though, they're not talking with cultural policy. It's completely done with the planning department and with economic development. So that's a conversation we still need to have.
No, for sure. And that's why that's a big push for what we're doing here, because that's the same as it is in most every city. Yeah.
But in a way, this whole pandemic has sort of helped, especially cultural policy here in the city, to actually now come closer to start discussing culture and creative industries topics within their policy field. So this is a huge achievement. Before that, it was all about the arts. So quite a very distinct way they do it here. But yeah.
It's Amanda. I feel like, hey, Carl, it's very good to see you. I feel like that's happening a lot, like in the US, like Seattle has a very impressive like land use policy for industrial land and what that's looking like, and Philadelphia too, and what's happening. But it's, to your point, Dan, it's like so removed from the cultural policy stuff. It's just completely ignored. And so like, I'm so fascinated by this idea of the silo of the industrial policy from cultural policy, and like whether the intervention, how do you bridge those? And is the intervention to make the arts part of the industrial policy as opposed to cultural policy part of the, when you think about who the players are and how to get them on the same, they're coming from.
And I think there's room for it. I mean, speaking to both of your points, because where we've seen the manufacturing try to reinvent itself and become more policy relevant is through advanced manufacturing. So, and that's, to be honest, I mean, that could encompass any kind of pulling AI or using a 3D printer or whatever can go into any kind of manufacturing activity. But the way it's framed is that it's high tech. And I guess for us, we just think there's room for going beyond the kind of craft manufacturing to argue for like really serious manufacturers that are cutting across these policy lines, and to get both sides to think differently about what it is they do and how they can actually work together. I mean, that's in essence, that's what, a big part of what we're trying to do.
Great. Well, that brings us to time, but I wanted to thank Carl. That was a super fascinating talk, and we're so happy to see all of our participants from across the world who've logged in for that. So thank you, Carl, so much for joining us today. Please join us for our next workshop. That's going to be, I believe, March 3rd, but I might be wrong. But we have Stephen Hadley in conversation with Alan Brown, and Stephen will be talking about his new book in the area of audience development and policy. So that should be really interesting. So thank you. Go get your second coffee if you're in Australia. Go eat your dinner if you're in the US, and I guess get your nightcap if you're somewhere else. All right. Thanks everyone.
So much.
Thank you very much, Carl. Keep up the great work.
Thanks. Bye.